Hey everybody, welcome back to another midweek Bible study every Wednesday at noon. And today we're taking a look at the book of Hosea. So let's jump right into it here. What we've got in the book of Hosea here is a review. What do you know about it? What happened in it? We're entering now the minor prophets in the Bible. And they're minor prophets biblically because they're short. For starters, but also I think sometimes they're minor because we don't know a lot about them. This is a great opportunity to kind of review these and to dig in a little bit more into what they're all about because they have some really, really important lessons. So if you are in a small group setting, this is a great time to hit pause and talk about what you already know about Hosea, and then we'll learn a little bit more about it later. All right. Let's jump right into the theme of Hosea, and I don't want you to miss it, so we're going to hit it right off the bat. The theme of Hosea is that God's love is greater than human sin, is that God's faithfulness is greater than my personally, unfaithfulness, which is an extraordinarily comfort and hope-filled message, especially now. Let's look at Hosea and see what the summary of it is, what happened in the book of Hosea, and kind of framing in human history, which I love. There's all these references to all these kings and of Assyria, which is this huge nation, and Egypt, and we have like these collection of writings back and forth between these actual, real, historical nations. So this is set in a particular time in history that God is about to break into. Hosea is the last prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. Sometimes that's called Ephraim. Sometimes he calls him Jacob, but that's a euphemism or stand-in for the nation of Israel. This takes place about 200 years after the northern kingdom broke off from the southern kingdom of Judah. Hosea was a prophet through 6 kings over the course of about 30 years. I think it was 25. Most of these kings came to power because they had assassinated the previous king. So it just kind of tells you a little bit about the tone of Hosea and like what's happening and this kind of like deteriorating spiral of what it was like. And then, of course, Hosea spoke for God on God's behalf during the worst of the kings, Jeroboam II. So now, historically, in the year 722, Assyria absolutely decimated Israel, and it would, in fact, never, the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom of Israel would never be a nation ever again. And Hosea was the lead up to it. Hosea saw the whole thing coming. Hosea was predicting it, and he was giving a why case before the event actually happened. So he knew it was coming, and he was saying, hey, listen, this is all going to happen, and when it does, I just want you to know why it's happening as it's happening. We'll take a look at Hosea in 3 sections. Let's jump right into those right now. Hosea 1-3 is an overview. I love some of these books of the Old Testament where right off the bat in chapter 1, often they just give an overview of like, this is what's going to happen. In the Bible, I had a preaching professor tell me one time, it's 3-step process to every great sermon. Tell the people what you're going to tell them, and part 3 is tell them what you just told them. Looks like that came right out of the Old Testament here because we see an overview, and we have kind of the whole arc of the story right off the bat in 1-3, where this is a story of broken marriage, where God commands Hosea to marry somebody named Gomer, and it's kind of unclear whether she's called an adulteress, but whether she was unfaithful before and during the marriage. But like this was not exactly I don't want to say it wasn't a match made in heaven, because I guess it was, but we wouldn't think of it necessarily that way. They had 3 kids together. We'll get to that later on. God tells Hosea that despite her unfaithfulness, he is to pay off her debt to her lovers, like the people that she was unfaithful with. And Hosea has to go and pay them all off. And, of course, stay with her through thick and thin, no matter what. I mean, that's a tall order, especially in those days. Now, the names of the kids that Hosea ends up giving to his children are Jezreel, Lo Ruhamah, and Lo Amai. And that means kid number 1 is God scatters, kid number 2 is not loved, and kid number 3 is not my people. You start to get the sense that God and Hosea are really making a point with this marriage, which is really kind of confusing. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The book of Hosea, I like this from this book where a lot of our content comes from by Michael Williams, The Jesus Lens. The book of Hosea includes more unfaithfulness than a daytime soap opera. Of course, this relationship, this marriage between Hosea and Gomer, is a prophetic symbol of God in God's people. That even though she's unfaithful, Hosea is commanded to be faithful to her no matter what. And of course, it isn't just about their marriage relationship. It's about God's relationship to his people. God is bringing us back to his covenant, his promise, his agreement, his contract with people. Sinai was the 10 Commandments. That was the mountain that Moses went up on, and God carved the 10 Commandments into stone and said, listen, as long as you follow these 10 Commandments, everything is going to be great for you. Everything is going to go tremendously well for you. That's the deal. I will be your God, and I'll provide land for you, and I'll provide a place and gardens and vineyards and homes. I'll provide so much for you, and all I'm asking you in return is that you hold your end of the deal. Follow these 10 commandments. And of course, they couldn't do it. Not even close. I mean, it wasn't even until Moses got back down from the mountain that they had carved and created this golden calf and worshipped it instead of God, who just brought them miraculously out of Egypt. And of course, every turn of the way, they were unfaithful and they turned toward other gods, including the Baal god. But this is what's important, is that even though they didn't hold up their end of the deal, God would still hold up his end of the deal, even though he clearly has an out. The people were not faithful. He could have said, well, I was extraordinarily generous in making that deal in the first place, that contract with you in the first place, that covenant with you in the first place, but you didn't want it, so now I'm done. He clearly had an out, but God didn't take it. He said, you know what? Even though you were unfaithful to your side, I'm still going to hold up my end. We're going to find another way. And Hosea is the human playing that out in real time. Why? And Hosea says it in chapter 2 of our first portion. It's because of God's love, God's compassion, and God's faithfulness. In the meantime, though, God says that this is going to hurt, because I'm going to allow you to experience the consequences of your sin, the consequences of your behavior, before breaking you back from it. And what this is going to look like is an imminent defeat by other nations in exile, but Israel will come back and God will bring a Messiah. This is the summary. The summary is that there's going to be a rebellion, there's going to be consequences, but don't forget that God's love is greater than human sin. God's faithfulness is greater than my personal unfaithfulness to God. And then we get into Hosea 4, the second part, causes and effects of unfaithfulness. On this middle part of Hosea, we see that the problem at the very, very core of it, in the deepest recesses of Israel's heart, is that they have no knowledge of God. And knowledge of God isn't just a human intellectual assent. Sometimes we say that intellectual assent, even to right doctrine or right belief, does not save. In this case, we see that the knowledge of God isn't just an intellectual assent. The word that's used there is this Hebrew word, yada, which means knowledge or a deep knowledge. It means to know. It's more than intellectual knowledge. It's a relationship. It's a knowledge of an intimacy of somebody in your life. It's a knowledge of, I know my wife, or a good friend, or I know somebody who's just on a very, very deep relational level. I just don't know things about them. You can memorize somebody's entire Wikipedia page, and you'd have an extreme level of English knowledge of them, but you wouldn't have necessarily any yada of them. And God wants his people to yada him and experience his love. He doesn't just want his people to know about them. Remember, in the book of James, even the demons believe the right things about God, knowledge about God, but they shudder because they don't have yada. They don't have that Hebrew knowledge, knowing, relationship, experience of love of God. So the Israelite people constantly showing how they break the Ten Commandments. They offer sacrifices to God like everything is fine. Hosea the prophet, he points this out. He goes, guys, you're constantly breaking these things. You're constantly breaking the rules, the commandments. And then you go to the temple and you offer sacrifices to God like he didn't just see what you did on Friday night. Right? You show up to church on Sunday and you pretend like nothing ever happened on Saturday night. And Hosea is going like, if he's going to be your God, he's going to be your God 7 days of the week, 168 hours a week, not just that 1 hour on Sunday morning or for them on Saturday night or something like that. And then he also poses this other argument here that's not only are they disobedient in terms of the covenant and the behavior, but also with the allegiances that they have. So on a political level, they're trusting their political allegiances to other nations like Egypt and Assyria. So Hosea says, hey, I got this word from God. Don't go into this political alliance with Egypt. They're going to burn you. Please stay away from Assyria. They're going to burn you. This is a tough move because Egypt was to the south, Assyria was to the northwest, and Assyria was massive, huge global power. And Egypt, of course, is this huge global power. And Israel was like this tiny little nation in between. Like they were at the 54th parallel, right? They were at the 50-yard line where the ball kept kind of getting tossed back and forth over. It was a tough place to be. And so Israel was just trying to navigate that and trying to carve out just a little bit of space for just them. And it was tough for Hosea to say, stay away from them. And they couldn't help it, but they entered into all these alliances and they made things very, very complicated and very difficult. And in the end, it wasn't very long at all. And Hosea was proved to be right. And Assyria did turn on them. And in 722, the entire nation fell, never to be a nation, the northern kingdom again. And then the final part in Hosea 12 to 14 is just a recap of saying this story that happened was a story that has been happening. And when we look into our family history, we can kind of understand why it happened. And he gives 3 examples. He gives Jacob's lying and treason from way back in Genesis. And he says, yeah, your forefather Jacob, who was named Israel, was kind of a treasonous person. He lied to his dad in his dad's old age to get the blessing and the birthright. Israel's wilderness rebellion in the book of Numbers 12 to 20, where God provided for Israel in the wilderness again and again and again, manna, but they just rebelled and against God and grumbled against God constantly. Israel's choice of Saul, they wanted to be just like other nations, and then they got to see what it was like to be just another nation. And so Hosea's point is generally some things never change. But in chapter 11, we have God saying this cool line as a loving father, and he says, I taught Israel to walk, and I led them with love. Israel was a rebellious son, but you can see that God is torn on this, and you can see his emotional, heart-wrenching. He's kind of going back from one side to the other side, to the other side, to the other side, bring severe consequences, but then forgiving them. You can see his anguish as God says these lines like, how can I give up on you? All my compassion is now aroused. And God says, eventually in the last chapter 14, I will heal their waywardness and love them freely. And you have this image of God's blessing through Abraham's family and these last words of Hosea, which is probably not the words of Hosea. It's probably like the editor who collected all these poems and sayings of Hosea and put them all kind of in order. And we see this editor kind of give his final conclusion on the entire book. And he says in chapter 14, verse 9, who is wise and discerning to understand all this? The ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them. Essentially, the editor of Hosea is saying that this story of Hosea and Gomer, of Israel and God and Assyria, and the story of Israel and God throughout the Old Testament is not something that just happened, but this is an ongoing story that continues to happen. And God is telling the ongoing story, and we see his heart to heal and save no matter what. This is a pretty cool story. of unfaithfulness and faithfulness and consequences, and eventually healing and saving from those consequences in time. So where do we spot Jesus in Hosea? Remember those names of the kids, which are just terrible names to give kids. That much we know. But Jezreel is a name that means God scatters, which is pretty interesting because in Revelation 7, we see the opposite happening. As after this, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one can count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, all gathered, not scattered, standing before the Lamb. Hosea and Gomer's middle child, not loved. We see in Jesus that Jesus demonstrated just how much we are loved to death and back again. And Hosea and Gomer's third child, not my people. 1 Peter 2:10, once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. The three names of the children are everything that went wrong in Israel's and ours unfaithfulness. And we can see in Jesus, everything that went wrong is made right again. In Jesus, every part that was unfaithful, the consequences of unfaithfulness, was made right. Everything sad came untrue and was redeemed in Jesus. It's a pretty cool picture. I want to give kind of a week ahead look. How does this story impact this week or impact today? And this is a story that's all about relationships. So I think it's a good checkpoint to pause and to recognize that not everyone is good at relationships, right? Like, I know I don't call my close friends nearly as often as I should. I don't ask other people how they're doing. I don't listen as responsively as I could and should. And the problem isn't just that I do this with my human relationships. We do this with God too, right? That we don't pray as often as we'd like to. We don't we trust other sources besides God. We fill God in with other sources of hope or inspiration or security. And in short, we're not always faithful to God, not nearly like we should be. And the point of Hosea and the point of the cross is that Hosea always is faithful. God always is faithful to Hosea, no matter what. It's a pretty cool picture. We got some group questions here. This is a good time to hit pause and talk about these questions in your group time together. Thanks for hanging out with Hosea. We'll see you next time.